My wife, 26 female, and I, 28 male, were married for 10 days, in a relationship for 4 years. It was at this point that she started acting guilty and closed off. We had just returned home from our honeymoon, and she'd been back to work as a bartender for 3 nights. When she came home from work that night, she was later than normal, and I could tell something was off. She got into the shower first, even though it was 3 a.m. She wore more clothes to bed than usual, and laid curled up on the edge instead of cuddling close like she usually did. My wife and I became each other's best friend. Since COVID, we had grown as a couple and as individuals. We had to work through arguments, disagreements, bad moods, and hopelessness. We watched a lot of informational videos about psychology and relationships together. Sometimes it caused a hot discussion, but my wife actually started to acknowledge that she believed too often that she was right, and refused to hear me out on sensitive topics. She always wanted us to be honest with each other, even if it was about us downloading a social media app. We had permission and the ability to check each other's phones. I had a video channel from when I was a teenager, and I honestly forgot about it until 3 years into our relationship. When she discovered this old channel, she freaked out on me. She accused me of lying by omission because I never told her about it. I told her she was overreacting because it was old, and I forgot about it. She did not want to hear that she was overreacting. It's like that's all she heard. The day after we were married, a friend of mine reached out to me regarding a video my wife posted on one of these internet apps. I watched it without telling her, then confronted her about having an account without telling me. She immediately became defensive, saying she only posted videos of our dogs. I tried to tell her that wasn't the point, that she'd been the one to say we should tell each other if we join one of these platforms, because they tend to be toxic and cause problems in relationships. Now was her opportunity to tell me I was the one overreacting. That's when I told her I saw the video, and knew that it wasn't of the dogs, it was of her dancing. She was surprised I saw it and knew the truth, but she didn't let that motivate her to take accountability or admit she lied. Instead, she asked me why I had to turn this into a reason to fight, and said she didn't want me to make a big deal out of this, since she didn't make a big deal out of my video channel. I reminded her that was from years ago, and this video of her dancing was made the day after our wedding, behind my back. She apologized to me, but it felt forced, like she was cornered into it. That brings us to 10 days after our wedding, when she came home late from work at the bar and showered before laying curled up on the edge of the bed. The bed started shaking a little. It felt like she was stifling her sobs. I sat straight up in bed and asked her if she was okay. She only nodded, trying to cover her face. I turned on the light and stared at her while she cried, expecting her to start talking. She finally admitted she cheated on me, but she didn't say it like that. She said a guy offered to give her a ride home when her car didn't start. She told me she accepted, and that he forced himself on her. I freaked out. I started screaming and crying in disbelief. I told her we were going to the police and needed to find this guy. I asked her if she knew him and what he looked like. She hesitated before answering me. Then she said she didn't want to tell the police, because he was a friend of hers. I found it hard to control my breathing, and I started pacing. It was hard for me to clarify the situation with her, because a voice in my head kept telling me that she wanted to sleep with this man. She was only sobbing at first because of the guilt she felt, but she couldn't tell me that because she didn't want to suffer the consequences of cheating. It didn't take long for me to start screaming at her to get out. She didn't want to report this friend of hers for forcing himself on her, because she didn't want him to go to jail. I asked her repeatedly if she wanted to have sex with this guy, and she said no. When I asked her to give me her phone, she went silent before asking me why. I said I wanted to check her messages, and she became extremely defensive. She wasn't upset anymore. She was mad at me for refusing to trust her. I reminded her that we had a role between us, that we could always check the other person's phone, because trust is continuously earned. I told her she seemed like she was lying and trying to avoid consequences. So by letting me check her phone, she proved her innocence. She refused, so I kicked her out. I started shoveling her stuff out onto the sidewalk. I grabbed trash bags and started throwing anything of hers outside. Despite her cries for me to stop and listen, she finally snapped out of anger, not remorse, and told me I was right. She did sleep with him and he was better than I ever was. That right there was the warped woman my wife had become. Her ego started to inflate until she couldn't resist the temptation to find another man. With all the dating apps and throwaway culture we live in, I wasn't really that surprised. I was just extremely disappointed that it happened to me. I loved this girl, and I know she loved me, but she let her ego control her decision making and make her believe she shouldn't have to be held accountable or suffer through any repercussions. After the dust settled, I started my own channel, talking about this crisis and how women today are being told they don't have to compromise, respect, or honor their man. As a matter of fact, many women today foolishly believe they don't need a man or any man at all in life. I became pretty popular, which only made my ex jealous and remorseful. Months after I kicked her out of the apartment, she started begging my forgiveness. She wants to get back with me badly, and tells me every day that I was and am the man she's meant to be with. Social media and the internet has helped to spread corruption, immorality, greed, and selfishness. Now it's easy to find support and encouragement to do the wrong thing. People are more than willing to give advice and encouragement to women who justify their own actions, or even completely omit what their part in the downfall of the relationship was. There are women who live their lives in complete denial of their own poor behavior and lack of morals. Don't give away the goods before the relationship and commitment is established. Marriage is meant to be selfless, completely fulfilling, and enjoyable. Love yourself and your spouse. When the individual stops thinking that they deserve more, better, or different, and starts living for their spouse's pleasure and joy, the marriage becomes blissful. Each person has their own love language, and if their partner learns and speaks it, and communicates openly with them about their own needs or wants without being demanding, things work out beautifully. Give yourself to your spouse wholeheartedly, because that's what marriage is. Thanks for sharing with us. Now let's get into our next story for today. My wife, 35 female, and I, 38 male, were married for 11 years. Her father and I worked together for even longer than that, which is how my wife and I met. I went to his house for a work party, and his daughter was there like a prize to be won. When I started talking to her, we hit it off before I knew she was my boss daughter. I stayed late into the night talking with her, until I knew I had to ask her on a date before leaving that night. She accepted. We dated properly, without consummating our relationship until we were both clearly serious about each other. Neither of us were talking to other people. Neither of us had those toxic social media accounts, and our families knew we belonged together. It was a beautiful relationship, and I felt like I was living life to the fullest with my loyal, honorable woman. Our wedding was a huge, wonderful event, and I wasn't nervous at all. I knew how serious she was about me, and I really felt like we were meant to last forever. Fast forward 10 years. Her father was forced to sell his business. He made a considerable amount of money from the sale, and since I was laid off, he gave me a large sum of money. It was enough for my wife and I to live off of for years, so I took my time looking for another job. I actually contemplated retirement or starting my own business from home. After spending all my days at home, I could tell my wife started to get distant and anxious. She wanted to know when I planned on getting out of the house. I asked if there was something she wanted us to do, and she said no. It didn't seem like she wanted to go on a trip with me, or get out of the house together. It just seemed like she wanted me to leave for a while. I didn't really get it because we loved each other's company, and the house was big enough that for some of the day we didn't see each other. We each had some alone time, but I also made sure I paid her adequate attention and spoke her love language. One day, I was reading in the living room, and I got a naughty image of my wife airdropped to me from her phone. It made my heart race, but not in a good way. Every bit of this felt wrong, like this picture wasn't intended for me. When she entered the room, I just looked at her and showed her the picture on my phone, waiting to gauge her response. She just smiled and played it off like it was intended to be a pleasant surprise for me. I suggested that next time she comes stand in front of me and start stripping. She just smirked and left the room. I made it my personal mission to check her phone at the next opportunity. So while she was cooking and had her back turned, I grabbed it. I found the same picture I saw, except this one was sent to none other than my former best man. The closest friend I had in this world, the man I asked to be in our wedding. I took screenshots of their fruity conversation, which included comments about how I wouldn't leave the house, and they were both desperate to hook up. Again, my whole world came crumbling down within an hour. I threw her phone at a head-level cabinet beside her, smashing it to bits. She screamed, so I rage screamed. Her eyes were as big as an owl, and she was as still as one too. I told her she cheated on me, and she was speechless. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew she couldn't deny it either. With her standing there, I sent the screenshots to her father, and said I wondered how she was going to get through life without me or her daddy to save her. Her face started to crumble, until she was a sobbing heap on the floor. I turned off the stove and told her to start packing her stuff, because I was filing for divorce. She turned so white her skin looked slightly green. She begged me for forgiveness, with all the strength she had left. She grabbed my pants and I pulled away. I told her I didn't deserve this heartbreak and disrespect, and that I wouldn't find it in my next wife, no matter how long she committed to me. Marriage is supposed to be beautiful and blissful, not what she turned ours into. She wailed breathless sobs as I pulled her out onto the porch, surrounded by piles of her belongings. She asked me who was coming to get her, and I said I didn't know. That was up to her to figure out. My former best man was married, so it was just 2 hours later that his wife discovered the truth. He was kicked out, and so my wife actually tried to ask him to come get her from my porch, and he cussed her out before blocking her. It was so dramatic and heartbreaking to experience this. I felt like my life became a horrible reality show that I did not relate to. I suddenly despised the woman I loved for so long. She tried calling her father. As soon as he answered, she sounded like a whiny little girl when she called him daddy, and tried to paint me as the monster to blame. He scolded her so loudly that I could hear it from the doorway. She tried to interject, but he wouldn't have it. He told her she did not behave like the lady he and her mother raised her to be, and he couldn't fathom how she had the gall and heartlessness to cheat on me, who he called an honorable, respectable man that didn't deserve this devastation and betrayal. He ended the phone call after telling her he would not be coming to save her from facing the consequences of her actions. It was a friend that my wife barely considered a friend that came to her rescue, and said she could stay in her spare bedroom. My wife had always bragged to this woman about how lucky she was to have me in the house we lived in. Her dad was the one paying for her car, so she only kept that until he told her to take over the payments. She couldn't afford them, so he took the car back. My ex had it all until her actions reduced her to nothing. I can only wish her luck recovering from such a stupid and unnecessary decision that changed our lives forever. OP, I am so sorry your wife did this to you. Your marriage started off properly, and should have worked out. The problem was that your wife was extremely entitled. She probably believed she was a prize to be won, and started to feel bored in her married life with you. It doesn't even mean you miss her husband did anything wrong. Her ego craved attention and flattery from other men, and what better man than one that stood just behind her husband at the altar? Women can be heartless and cruel when it comes to needing their inflated egos stroked. It isn't enough for these women to be selfless and honorable wives. I'm sure a majority of them don't know the meaning of selflessness, accountability, or what an honorable wife would even do or offer her husband. They are sick and obsessed with themselves. I am sorry that you had to go through this experience. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, comment below with your thoughts on what happened. If there is a story you would like to share with me about your own situation or someone else's, then please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care. My father warned me before my wedding that he believed my fiancé copyright would cheat on me if presented with an opportunity. I hated that he told me this. I never had a good relationship with my father, and I believed he was jealous that my fiancé copyright was prettier than my mom and really in love with me. I didn't plan on having a close relationship with him during my married life. My mom was different. I could tell her anything, and she was really supportive. I almost felt bad she was still married to my asshole of a father. I went through with the marriage because my woman never gave me something to worry about. We were married for 7 years, living an hour and a half away from my parents, that entire time before more than one marriage came to an abrupt end. My wife had a job 30 minutes away in the direction of my parents' house. She started to become condescending and rude to me in February of that year. Eventually, I felt like the less I said, the better. So we just started watching movies or shows together when she was home from work. I worked from home writing and recording music. There. When I first started getting gigs, my wife was really supportive and came to my shows. After a few years, she got bored with it. I think she wished for me to become rich and famous. My wife continued disrespecting me and getting snappy until she told me she needed to start working late sometimes. I didn't believe that was the case. I waited in my car in her work parking lot. When she left at the usual time, she drove the opposite direction of work. I followed her all the way to my parents' house. I turned off my car lights way down the road and just inched closer along the curb. I saw my dad get in the car with her before she drove away. Was all I could think as I followed them at a long distance. I called my mom as I drove. She was out to dinner with a group of old friends. She asked me if anything was wrong and if she needed to come home, and I told her no. I said she could call me tomorrow. I didn't want to tell her what was happening. They pulled into a shopping center suddenly, and I think it was because they suspected they were being followed. I continued on, pulling into a neighborhood shortly ahead. I could see through the trees the moment my wife's car pulled out. They literally drove down the street to a hotel. I parked my car next to hers. This couldn't be happening. Did she drive my dad to a hotel? How was I supposed to get through something like this? How was my mom supposed to get through this? It was so unfair. After this, I was going to move out of state. My wife and father came out of the hotel an hour later. I was waiting by my wife's car and she freaked out when she saw me. My dad had a strange demeanor. I then decided to walk up to him and punched him in the face. He fell down and a hotel employee saw this. They called the police. My wife was already crying. She couldn't believe I was there. I think because I was there, she was more abruptly hit with the reality of what she'd done. She cried really hard, telling me she was sorry repeatedly. I screamed some choice words at her while my dad got to his feet. I told him he was a horrible father, and the only reason my wife slept with him was that he convinced her to. I told him he was dead to me. I looked at my wife and called her a worthless harlot. I told her I would never see her again after our divorce was final. She reached out for me with tears streaming down her face like she needed a forgiving embrace. I pushed her away and she started crying even more. I got in my car to leave, but the police showed up. I told them everything that happened, and my dad, surprisingly, didn't press charges against me for punching him. My wife apparently felt some remorse because she refused to give my dad a ride home. The police had to. I found out the next morning that he told my mom he was mugged while on a walk. I ignored all the calls and texts from my wife. She apparently slept in the hotel parking lot in her car, since I told her she wasn't welcome in my house anymore. My mom called me the next morning, which is when she told me about the mugging. As hard as it was, I told her what happened the night before. At first, she didn't believe me, but then it made more sense to her, and she knew I wouldn't lie about this. She wasn't as upset as I thought. She was more apologetic to me because it was my wife. She said she hadn't been very happy in the relationship for a while now, and this was a good time to end it. I was relieved we could support each other through the divorce process. My mom moved in with me and my wife moved in with my dad. She only stayed there for 1 week though. My dad said she wasn't worth keeping around. Due to the infidelity and the police report that recorded the three of us at the hotel, my mom and I each got to keep our houses. My dad moved into a motel. My mom's house was built in such a way that it could easily be transformed into 2 independent living spaces. I used the money from selling my house to remodel my mom's house so I could live with her. She loved this idea. We each had our own front door, but we lived in the same place. We kept each other company and gave each other support. My wife moved out of state instead of me. She apparently had a distant cousin to live with in Philadelphia. My ex tried apologizing and asking me if we could move on from it, even after the divorce. She had a hard time accepting we were over, and she told me she missed me every day. I'm sorry, but cheating on me with my father is unforgivable. She didn't deserve to have anyone trust her again. As soon as she got a new boyfriend, I took the liberty of sharing with him through social media what my ex did to me. At first he didn't believe me, but he broke up with her a month later. My ex called me crying and yelling at me. I told her I didn't do anything wrong. If anything, I spared him heartbreak. She said she wouldn't do that ever again, and I asked her what made her do it to me. She said she didn't know, but my dad talked to her about how I never grew up to be a man and she could be loved better. I haven't spoken to my dad since that day. I don't know where he is or what happened to him. My mom hasn't spoken to him either, but we're there for each other. We each found a new person to start dating, so that's cool. I don't respond or answer calls from my ex anymore, and I won't barge into her dating life again. I realized I have to move on, and if I'm speaking with every new partner she has, I'm not moving on very well. I've actually gotten more gigs and income from my music since this happened. It's the thing I enjoy the most in life, and the fact that I can pursue this dream makes me a very happy man. Wow, OP. I am so sorry your father treated you this way. It's incredibly wrong and inappropriate of him. I'm glad you and your mom cut him out of your lives. It's amazing you both had each other for support, but so disappointing that this even happened. I'm relieved no charges were pressed against you in the heat of the moment discovering your wife cheated on you. You made the right decision to immediately separate from your wife and file for divorce. I don't think anyone could completely forgive or move past this level of betrayal. Your wife had already started to see you in a bad light. She should have been mature enough to know how she felt about you independently of how your father felt about you. I believe you will find a woman who's mature enough to know that trust and communication are needed if a relationship is meant to last. A successful relationship needs two selfless and considerate people who don't let their egos get out of hand. Thank you for sharing your story. Now let's get into today's second story. My wife, 25, took up a part-time job with Uber Eats to help earn us some extra money. I, 29, just started a good job, but I wouldn't be paid very much until my first raise after the training period. My wife was out driving around a lot, and she had this one male friend that she talked to all the time. They'd been friends since they were 12, so when we got married, I didn't feel like I had a right to end the friendship. It had only ever been a friendship all the way to this point, so I didn't feel very worried about it. I knew her Facebook password, which was the only platform she used to message or call anyone, but I never logged into it until one particular day. On this day, I was at work and she was Uber eating. Suddenly, for no reason at all, my brain told me to log into my wife's Facebook. I was pretty weirded out by it and hesitated. The longer I waited, the worse I felt, so I did it, and I was shocked. She was live messaging the friend I mentioned, and they were making arrangements for her to come over again. He mentioned that it was really convenient she was doing a delivery job and had a reason to be out. She said it was the perfect opportunity for them to have plate dates all the time. I can't tell you how much panic I felt in my chest. I just happened to log into her Facebook at work and read this. I called my coworker over. We were pretty good friends and told him what was going on. He asked if their messages had an address in them, and they did, from 4 months ago. I was on the verge of throwing up. I couldn't imagine my wife going behind my back like this even once. My coworker noticed how upset I was, and he gave me a pat on the back. He said his wife cheated on him 2 years ago, and since then he's met a new woman who hasn't wronged him even once. It really helped to hear that at the moment, but I didn't want to apply it to my situation yet. He suggested I file for divorce right away. Couldn't. I had to confront her first. Maybe I would the next day, but I just wanted to see what she had to say. I scrolled through the messages, some getting incredibly sexual or flirtatious. The first, "I love you," I saw was a knife through the heart. That's what made me decide to file for divorce. When I got home, I waited for my wife to walk through the front door. My coworker actually came over for the first time that night to be my support. As soon as my wife entered, she saw us sitting in the living room. I introduced her to him and said he is my witness and support while I go through this time in my life. She was really confused and asked what I meant by that. I asked her how her play date went. I'm sure her heart stopped at this moment. She looked like she saw the Grim Reaper, and then she fainted. When she came to, she was laying on the couch. I asked her again how her play date went, and she covered her face. She started wailing and crying. I told her I didn't have time for all this and wanted an answer. She just said she couldn't. I went and got my packed stuff with the help of my coworker, and we loaded up his car and mine. She was freaking out the whole time, begging me to forgive her and let her prove to me she would never do this again. I told her I married her with the promise of her being faithful. Now that I knew she wasn't, why would I stick around? My coworker nodded in agreement as he helped me. I followed him to his house and stayed there while I looked for a new place to live. Unfortunately, my wife's mom owned the apartment we lived in and she didn't like me very much. Speaking of my MIL, my wife begged me not to tell her what she'd done because then she certainly wouldn't be allowed to live there anymore. I told her I wouldn't, but she still found out. When MIL found out we were divorcing, she grilled her daughter for so long that she admitted to what she did. Mail was so disgusted and disappointed in her that she kicked her out and told her if she was going to be a slut, she could do it to earn a roof over her head. My wife continued doing Uber Eats but started sleeping in her car at night, showering at truck stops, and using lots of Febreze on her clothes and car seats. Her AP already had a roommate and absolutely refused to let anyone else move in with them. If he genuinely loved her, you'd think AP would find them a new place to live or something, but 6 months later, my ex was still living in her car. She gained a lot of weight from all the fast food, so that alone was karma. Then she met someone else and started sleeping there sometimes, but she messaged me often. Some days she was really upset at herself and claimed she missed me, but other days she was bitter and mean towards me for dumping her and leaving her without a dime. Sometimes I replied, but I never led her on or really cared about what she told me. All I wanted to do was distance myself from her. I'm really glad we didn't conceive children at this point because that would have been much more complicated. Gotta look at the bright side and focus on how happy you can be to have another chance at selecting a better mate. I found a house for sale through my coworker and I have him over for dinner and vice versa all the time. We became best friends in this process. Wow, OP. I'm glad you had a coworker there with you who'd been through something similar and had good advice. I'm also glad your MIL backed up the fact your ex messed up by kicking her out. Your ex was not considering anyone but herself when she decided to start an affair with her friend. There are too many people in the world to break your spouse's heart just so you can offer yourself to someone else. They don't have to be with anyone who's in a relationship. Anyone can find someone new if they look in the right place. If anything was wrong in the relationship, it's the unhappy person's responsibility to communicate what the problem is. If they aren't sure what the problem is, they should start by telling their spouse that there is an unknown problem and describe how they feel at certain times. It can be something two people work together to diagnose and solve, but only if both are willing and mature enough to do it. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you all for taking